The buzzing hum of the interstellar hub station echoed through the towering glass and steel walls of Helion Enterprises as Jack Marlowe weaved his way through the maze of towering corridors. His heart beat a little faster than usual, though he couldn't be sure if it was the lingering effects of his third cup of synth coffee or the nervous energy humming beneath his skin. Today was no ordinary day at Helion. Whispers of the impending change in leadership had spread through the corporate grapevine weeks ago, but today it would be made official. The new CEO, a mysterious alien woman from a far-off system, was scheduled to arrive, and the entire company seemed to be holding its breath in anticipation. Even Jack, usually skeptical of corporate gossip, felt a strange sense of unease settle in his chest. Helion Enterprises wasn't just any company, it was the beating heart of intergalactic trade. It managed resources across star systems, controlling the ebb and flow of planetary economies. Working here had always felt like sitting on the edge of something monumental, but today, with the impending arrival of their new leader, it felt more like standing on a precipice. Jack adjusted his jacket as he neared the main atrium where the announcement was to be made. The vast space stretched high above, with transparent walls revealing the busy traffic of ships docking and departing the station, like fireflies darting across a summer night. As he stood among his colleagues, eyes drawn to the front stage where the announcement would soon take place, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to unfold, something far beyond a mere change in management. He checked the time, noting that Zalera, the new CEO, was expected to address the staff any minute. He'd heard rumors about her vague descriptions of her otherworldly beauty and imposing presence. No one seemed to know much about her, except that she was from a distant star system, Nire 9, home to a species known for their psionic abilities. There was something unsettling about the idea of an alien species capable of mental influence, but Jack pushed those thoughts aside. This was a corporate environment, after all. Power was wielded by deals and documents, not telepathy. The lights dimmed slightly, signaling that the announcement was about to begin. A hush fell over the room as the soft clink of polished boots against the marble floor echoed across the atrium. Jack's eyes darted toward the far end of the room, where the imposing double doors began to slide open with a soft, mechanical hiss. And there she was. Zalera entered the atrium with a measured grace, her steps purposeful and elegant. Everything about her demanded attention without effort, an aura of quiet authority that silenced the room in an instant. She was tall, taller than most humans, with skin the color of a deep, muted violet, as if the night sky had painted itself onto her. Her hair, an impossibly long cascade of silver, shimmered under the soft lighting, flowing like liquid mercury over her shoulders and down her back. But it was her eyes that commanded the most attention. They were a luminous silver, reflecting the light in an almost unsettling way, as though they could see through layers of reality that others couldn't perceive. Jack found himself holding his breath as her gaze swept across the room, taking in the gathered employees. When her eyes landed briefly on him, he felt an unexpected flicker of heat in his chest, a brief surge of adrenaline that made his pulse quicken. It was nothing more than a fleeting glance, but it left Jack unsettled, as though she'd seen more than just the surface of him in that moment. "Welcome to the new era of Helion Enterprises." Her voice was smooth, controlled, and rich, with an accent Jack couldn't quite place. It was the kind of voice that demanded obedience without needing to raise it. Zalara's introduction was brief, professional, and to the point. She spoke of the future, of new opportunities, and of maintaining Helion supremacy in an increasingly competitive galaxy. But beneath her words, there was a current of something else, something unspoken yet palpable, like an invisible tension stretching across the room. The speech ended swiftly, with a promise of a more detailed strategy briefing for the higher-ups in the coming days. The lights returned to their normal brightness, and as the employees began to disperse, Jack remained in place for a moment, unable to shake the lingering impact of her presence. His mind raced, trying to dissect the brief interaction, to rationalize the way her mere appearance had stirred something deep inside him. As the room cleared out, Jack turned to leave, his thoughts still swirling. But as he made his way toward the exit, he felt a sudden, gentle brush against his arm, a touch so light that it could have been accidental. He froze, instinctively looking down at where her hand had made contact. It was Zalera. She had moved past him, her violet fingers just grazing his skin as she walked by. The moment their skin touched, a shock of warmth shot through Jack's arm, spreading rapidly through his entire body. It was as though a current of energy had passed from her into him, but it wasn't painful, it was intoxicating. His breath caught in his throat as a rush of heat settled in his chest, his pulse pounding in his ears. For a moment, the world around him seemed to blur, the sounds of the bustling atrium fading into a distant murmur. He could feel it, a connection, a brief but intense link that went far deeper than any physical touch should. Jack blinked, his mind trying to catch up with what had just happened. He turned to look at her, but Zalara was already several steps ahead, her pace unfaltering, as though nothing had happened. Her head was held high, her focus straight ahead, and there was no indication that she had even noticed the effect her touch had on him. His fingers twitched involuntarily, the residual warmth of her touch lingering on his skin. Jack swallowed hard, trying to shake the sensation, but it was like a fire that refused to be extinguished. He stood there, rooted in place, watching her until she disappeared into a side corridor, her silver hair swaying with each step. What the hell just happened? He thought, his mind still spinning from the encounter. The rest of the day passed in a blur for Jack, his focus shattered by the events of that morning. No matter how hard he tried to concentrate on his work, his thoughts kept circling back to Zalara, to the strange warmth of her touch, to the way she had looked at him as if, for a split second, he had been the only person in the room. He had never felt anything like it before. It wasn't just attraction, though there was no denying her beauty. It was something deeper, something primal. The way her touch had resonated through him had felt almost psychic. But that was impossible, wasn't it? No one at Helion had mentioned anything about her possessing such powers. Then again, there were plenty of things about Zalara that remained a mystery. Her species, the Neuromeans, were known for their secrecy. For all he knew, their abilities could extend far beyond anything the galaxy understood. By the time Jack left his office that evening, the sensation of Zalara's touch had faded to a dull warmth, but the memory of it still lingered in the back of his mind, unsettling and exhilarating all at once. As he stepped onto the hover tram that would take him back to his quarters, Jack gazed out at the shimmering lights of the spaceport beyond, his mind racing with questions. Who was Zalara, really, and what had just happened between them? One thing was certain: his life at Helion Enterprises was no longer going to be the same. The days after Zalara's arrival at Helion Enterprises unfolded like a series of charged moments, each more disconcerting than the last. For Jack Marlowe, the routine of corporate life meetings, reports and deadlines began to blur as his mind wrestled with a new obsession. He had always been ambitious, driven by a desire to prove himself in one of the most powerful intergalactic corporations. But now that drive was clouded by a single, inescapable question: what had Zalara done to him? That first brush of her fingers hadn't been a simple touch. Jack was sure of it. In the days that followed, his body seemed to retain an echo of her warmth, a subtle yet persistent thrum of energy that refused to dissipate. At night, in the quiet of his apartment, he could feel it under his skin, humming like a hidden current. And it wasn't just physical; his mind felt different, too sharper, more attuned, like a wire strung too tight. He found himself awake at odd hours, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts chasing her. But Zalara remained distant. In the weeks since she'd taken over as CEO, she had maintained a cold professionalism, keeping her interactions with the staff minimal and strictly business-oriented. Meetings were efficient and to the point, her directives delivered with an air of quiet authority that brooked no argument. She was efficient, calculating, and seemingly detached from the mundane concerns of her human subordinates. Jack had watched her in these meetings, his attention drawn to her almost against his will, hoping to catch a flicker of recognition in her eyes when they met his. But there was nothing. It was as though the moment they had shared the strange, heated connection had been erased from her mind. Was it all in his head? Jack often wondered. But no, it couldn't be. There had been something there, something undeniable. It had been real. Too real. Too real. Weeks later, the tension between Jack's rational mind and his unsettling obsession with Zalara came to a head. It happened on an otherwise uneventful Tuesday morning, during a particularly tedious briefing about the company's latest planetary acquisition. The Glaron sector, a distant and resource-rich cluster, had been secured by Helion Enterprises in a move that promised to generate trillions in revenue. Jack had been invited to sit in on the executive meeting as part of a small team handling the logistics. He wasn't paying attention, not really. His mind was elsewhere, half tuned to the conversation about trade agreements and mining rights, and half focused on Zalara, who sat at the head of the long, sleek conference table. Her violet skin shimmered faintly under the soft lighting, and her silver eyes scanned the data scrolling across the holoscreen with dispassionate efficiency. She was, as always, unreadable. Until suddenly she wasn't. As the discussion around the table continued, Jack felt a shift in the air. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but there. A psychic tremor, like the softest of whispers brushing against his consciousness. His gaze snapped to Zalara, and for the briefest of moments their eyes met across the room. In that instant the world seemed to tilt. The hum of voices faded, the steady pulse of the holoscreens dimmed, and all Jack could focus on was the sharp, electric connection that seemed to hum between them. Her expression remained neutral, her posture relaxed, but Jack knew. He could feel it, a faint, invisible tendril of thought stretching out from her, touching his mind. His pulse quickened. Was she doing it on purpose? Was she testing him? Or was this something else entirely? Jack inhaled sharply, trying to focus, but his thoughts felt tangled, like static in his brain. He clenched his hands beneath the table, trying to steady his breathing, trying to shake the growing sense of disorientation. The warmth that had simmered under his skin since that first touch flared up again, stronger this time, like a heat that swelled from his chest and spread outward. His vision blurred, the edges of the room softening as the strange connection between him and Zalara deepened. Just as quickly as it had started, the sensation vanished. The world snapped back into focus, the dull hum of conversation rushing back into his ears. Jack blinked, dazed, and saw that Zalara had already looked away, her attention now fixed on another executive who was droning on about mining quotas. No one else in the room seemed to notice the strange moment that had passed between them. Jack's hands were shaking. The meeting ended and the room emptied, but Jack remained seated, staring at the table in front of him as though it might hold the answers to the questions burning in his mind. His heart was still racing, his body still tingling with that residual warmth, that strange energy that had flared to life in Zalara's presence. What the hell is happening to me? He thought, running a hand through his hair in frustration. The sensation, the connection had been real. He was sure of it. But what did it mean? Why was this happening? As Jack stood to leave, gathering his things, he felt a presence behind him. He turned, and his breath caught in his throat. Zalara stood there, watching him with those unnerving silver eyes, her expression as unreadable as ever. "Mr. Marlowe," she said softly, her voice a low, rich note in the now empty room. "May I speak with you for a moment?" Jack swallowed, his mouth suddenly dry. "Of course." She gestured for him to follow, and he did, his legs feeling unsteady as they walked side by side down the corridor. Zalara led him to a small, private conference room at the far end of the executive wing, the door sliding shut behind them with a soft hiss. Jack stood awkwardly by the window, trying to keep his breathing, even as she crossed the room with that same graceful, predatory elegance that seemed to define her every movement. For a moment she said nothing, simply regarding him with those piercing eyes. Jack felt the weight of her gaze settle on him like a tangible thing, heavy and intense. His skin prickled under the scrutiny, the heat that had flared to life in the meeting still simmering just beneath the surface. Finally she spoke. "You felt it, haven't you?" Her voice was soft but laced with a sharp edge, like the whisper of a blade. Jack blinked, his throat tight. "Felt what?" Zalara tilted her head slightly, her silver eyes narrowing. The connection. She stepped closer, and Jack instinctively took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. "Don't pretend you haven't noticed. I can sense it in you." He swallowed hard, his mind racing. So he hadn't imagined it. The touch, the warmth, the strange psychic link, it was real. She knew. But that only raised more questions. What was this connection? Why was it happening? I don't understand," Jack stammered, his voice thick with confusion. "What is this? What's happening to me?" Zalara regarded him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she lifted her hand, reaching out toward him. Jack flinched, instinctively stepping back, but there was nowhere to go. The wall was behind him now, and Zalara was too close, her presence overwhelming. Her hand hovered just inches from his chest, her fingers curling in the air, as though she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. "This is not something that happens often," she murmured, her voice low, almost a whisper. "But when it does, it cannot be ignored." Her hand moved closer, and Jack tensed, every muscle in his body coiled tight. But instead of touching him, she let her hand hover just above his chest, as if feeling the energy between them. And that's when Jack felt it, a pulse of heat, stronger this time, surging through him like a wave crashing against the shore. His breath hitched, his body trembling with the force of it. "What is this?" he asked again, his voice barely more than a whisper. Zalara's eyes flickered, her gaze never leaving his. "A bond," she said quietly. "Something beyond what your kind understands. It connects us, beyond the physical." Jack's mind reeled. A bond? Between them? But that made no sense. He barely knew her. How could something like this happen? Zalara lowered her hand, stepping back slightly, and the heat between them lessened, though it didn't disappear entirely. Jack sagged against the wall, his head spinning. "Why me?" he asked, his voice rough. "Why is this happening to me?" Zalara's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile, though there was no warmth in it. That she said, "Is the question, isn't it?" For the rest of the day, Jack moved through the motions of his duties in a daze, the weight of Zalara's words pressing down on him like a heavy mantle. A bond, something beyond the physical. The concept was both terrifying and intoxicating. He hadn't asked for this, hadn't sought it out, but now it was there, like a living thing between them, impossible to ignore. That night, as he lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, Jack felt the heat again. It was subtle this time, a quiet hum beneath his skin, like an engine idling in the distance. But it was there, and it wasn't going away. He didn't know what it meant or where it would lead, but one thing was clear: his life was no longer his own. Whatever this bond was, it had changed him, irrevocably. And now there was no turning back. The days following Jack's private encounter with Zalara were a blur of confusion, tension, and something else that Jack couldn't quite put into words. He moved through his work at Hylian Enterprises like a man walking through a fog. Everything around him felt muted, dull in comparison to the intensity of the bond that now hummed beneath his skin. He couldn't focus, couldn't think straight. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt her presence. Every time he was alone, the warmth of that strange connection flickered to life inside him, like a low burning flame that never fully extinguished. And Zalara? She remained as distant as ever. It was as though nothing had happened between them. She continued her role as CEO with the same cool efficiency, issuing commands, holding meetings, and maintaining that air of authority that both fascinated and unnerved him. But now, Jack couldn't look at her without feeling the weight of that unspoken bond pressing between them. He knew she felt it too. How could she not? Yet she gave him nothing, no acknowledgement, no explanation. It was driving him mad. Every time she entered a room, Jack's senses sharpened, attuned to her in a way that felt primal, instinctive. His body responded to her presence before his mind could catch up the sudden spike of heat, the rush of energy that surged through him, his pulse quickening. He tried to avoid her, tried to keep his distance, but it was impossible. Hylian's corporate structure ensured that their paths crossed constantly, and each time they did, the bond flared to life again, pulling at him like a gravitational force he couldn't escape. And then, one evening, everything changed. It was late, well past the normal working hours, and most of the staff had already left the building. Jack, however, was still at his desk, staring blankly at a holographic report that he had been reading for over an hour, but had barely absorbed. His mind was elsewhere, as it always seemed to be these days. Zalara. The bond. The questions that swirled endlessly in his head with no answers. The office was quiet, the lights dimmed to a soft glow. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the spaceport was alive with the distant flicker of ships coming and going, their thrusters leaving trails of light in the dark void. Jack's reflection stared back at him from the glass, his expression tired, haunted. Just as he was about to shut down his terminal and leave for the night, the soft sound of footsteps echoed in the empty corridor behind him. Jack froze, his body instinctively tensing. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. He could feel her Zalara. That familiar warmth sparked to life within him, more intense now, as though her very presence ignited something deep inside him that he couldn't control. She appeared in the doorway, her figure silhouetted against the soft light of the corridor. As always, she looked effortlessly poised, her long, silver hair cascading over her shoulders like molten metal. Her violet skin seemed to shimmer faintly in the low light, and those piercing silver eyes locked onto him with an intensity that made his breath catch. "You're still here," she said, her voice low and smooth, with that ever-present note of command. Jack swallowed, trying to steady himself. "I couldn't focus," he admitted, his voice sounding rougher than he intended. "There's too much on my mind." Zalara took a step into the room, her gaze never leaving him. The air between them seemed to thrum with tension, the bond stretching taut, pulling at him with invisible threads. "I know," she said softly, and those two words held more weight than he could have anticipated. Jack pushed back from his desk, standing abruptly, his hands gripping the edge of the table, as though it were the only thing anchoring him in place. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice breaking the fragile silence. "This connection between us. I can feel it all the time. I can't think. I can't sleep. I can't sleep." He stopped himself, breathing hard. The words had spilled out of him before he could stop them, raw and unfiltered. But they were true. Every single one of them. Zalara regarded him calmly, her expression unreadable. But there was something in her eyes now, a flicker of emotion that hadn't been there before, something she was trying to keep hidden but couldn't entirely suppress. "You are feeling the effects of our bond," she said finally, her voice quieter now. "It is. Stronger than I expected." Jack let out a sharp breath, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Stronger? That's all you have to say? It's consuming me, Zalara. I can't. I don't know how to handle this." For the first time, Zalara seemed to hesitate. She stepped closer, her movements slow, deliberate. Jack felt his pulse quicken as the space between them shrank. The heat from her presence was almost overwhelming now, the bond between them thrumming like a live wire. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, almost hesitant. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "I didn't expect it to manifest so strongly in you. A human. You're kind. You're not usually susceptible to this kind of connection." Jack frowned, his confusion deepening. "This kind of connection," he repeated, his voice strained. "What do you mean? What is this, really?" Zalara's gaze flickered, and for a moment Jack thought she might turn away, might retreat behind that cold, distant mask she always wore. But then she stepped even closer, until she was standing right in front of him, her face just inches from his. The tension between them was electric now, a palpable force that made the air feel charged, heavy with unspoken words and unacknowledged emotions. "My species, the Nereians we are," different Zalara began, her voice barely more than a whisper. "We don't form bonds like humans do. We connect on a deeper level, a psychic level. It's not something we can control. When we form a connection with someone, it is permanent. It ties us together, mind and body." Jack felt his heart pound in his chest. Permanent. The word echoed in his mind, sending a shiver down his spine. "And you formed this bond with me." Zalara hesitated, her silver eyes darkening slightly. "Not intentionally," she said. "But yes, the moment we touched, it began. I felt it immediately, but I didn't realize it would affect you so deeply." Jack stared at her, his mind spinning. "Why me?" he asked, his voice low, almost desperate. "Why did this happen with me?" For the first time, Zalara's calm facade seemed to crack. She looked away, her jaw tightening slightly as though she were grappling with something she didn't want to admit. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "It's rare, even among my kind. But with you," she trailed off, her gaze returning to his, and there was something in her eyes now that Jack hadn't seen before: vulnerability. "It's different." Jack exhaled slowly, trying to process her words, but it felt impossible. The idea of a bond that tied them together, something that went beyond the physical and into the realm of the mind, the soul, it was overwhelming. And yet, somehow it made sense. He had felt it from the very first moment she touched him. That strange warmth, the pull between them. It had been there all along, just waiting to surface. But now, as he stood there, with Zalara so close, her presence wrapping around him like a cloak, Jack felt something else rising within him: desire. It wasn't just the bond, though that was part of it. It was her. The way she looked at him, the way her touch had set his blood on fire, the way her presence seemed to fill every empty space around him. And then, as if she could sense his thoughts, Zalara took that final step forward, closing the distance between them entirely. Her hand lifted, hesitating for only a second before her fingers brushed lightly against his cheek. Jack's breath hitched, his skin burning where she touched him, the heat between them flaring into something almost unbearable. "Jack," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath, and in that moment, all the tension, all the unanswered questions, all the uncertainty fell away, leaving only the undeniable pull between them. Before he could stop himself, Jack reached for her, his hands sliding around her waist, pulling her against him. The moment their bodies touched, it was like an explosion of heat, a surge of energy that seemed to radiate from the very core of their beings. His lips found hers, and the kiss was fierce, hungry, born of weeks of pent-up desire and frustration. Zalara responded in kind, her hands tangling in his hair as she pressed closer, her body fitting against his, as though they were two halves of the same whole. The bond between them flared to life, and Jack felt it like a fire in his veins, burning through him with an intensity that left him breathless. It wasn't just physical, it was mental, emotional, something far deeper than anything he had ever experienced. He could feel her thoughts, her emotions, the weight of her existence pressing against his own, and it was intoxicating. For what felt like an eternity, they were lost in each other, the room around them forgotten as the bond between them deepened, solidified. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, Zalara pulled back, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her eyes dark with emotion. "This changes everything," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Jack nodded, his heart still racing, his mind still spinning from the intensity of their connection. "I know." In the aftermath of their encounter, the air between them felt different, charged, yes, but also more grounded, as though the bond that had been quietly building for weeks had finally settled into place. Zalara didn't say anything else, but the look in her eyes told Jack everything he needed to know. Whatever this was, whatever strange connection they shared, it wasn't going away, and now that they had crossed this line, there was no going back. Jack wasn't sure what the future held, whether this bond would bring them closer or pull them apart, but one thing was certain: his life had changed irrevocably in that moment. The bond that tied him to Zalara was real, and it was powerful, more powerful than either of them had realized. And now, they would have to face the consequences together. But for the first time since Zalara's arrival, Jack wasn't afraid. The bond between them might have been forged by something alien, something beyond his understanding, but it was there now, and it was theirs. And whatever came next, they would face it together. The atmosphere at Helion Enterprises had shifted. It was subtle. Most of the employees continued with their daily routines, unaware of the growing tension that rippled beneath the surface, but for Jack Marlowe, the change was as tangible as the air he breathed. After the night he and Zalara had shared, everything had changed. The bond between them was no longer a strange, abstract sensation he couldn't explain. It was real, powerful, and now it was clear that it had come with consequences neither of them fully understood. Jack tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, throwing himself into his work, attending meetings, and running reports as if nothing had happened. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was moving beneath the surface of the corporation, like the shadow of a storm waiting to break. Zalara had been even more distant since that night, not cold, but guarded. She had returned to her role as the unflinching CEO, her every move precise and controlled, her emotions carefully hidden behind that familiar mask of calm authority. But Jack could feel the bond humming between them, a constant thread that linked them across the distance, pulsing with an energy that neither of them could deny. And with that bond came something else: awareness. Jack's senses had sharpened, his mind somehow more attuned to the undercurrents of the world around him. He noticed things he hadn't before: the flickers of unease in the faces of his colleagues, the whispered conversations that cut off abruptly when he entered a room, the strange tension that seemed to permeate the higher levels of the company. Something was wrong, something dangerous. It began with small things. At first, Jack chalked it up to paranoia, his mind playing tricks on him in the aftermath of everything that had happened. But as the days passed, the oddities became too pronounced to ignore. Data files went missing from the company's secure servers, replaced with corrupted versions that made no sense. A shipment of valuable resources from one of Helion's mining colonies was inexplicably delayed, only to reappear later with falsified records. And then there were the unfamiliar faces, figures in the corridors that Jack didn't recognize, employees whose names didn't appear on any of the company's official rosters. At first he thought it was just the usual corporate espionage companies like Helion, with their vast intergalactic influence, were always at risk from rival factions looking to sabotage their operations. But this felt different, more deliberate, more personal. Jack wasn't the only one who noticed. Zalara, too, had grown more tense, though she hid it well behind her veil of calm. In private moments when their bond flared to life, Jack could sense her growing unease, a tightening coil of anxiety that she refused to acknowledge aloud. She had taken steps to increase security around the company's most sensitive operations, stationing trusted guards near the core facilities and locking down access to the most classified projects. But it wasn't enough to quell the gnawing sense that something much larger was at play. And then, one night, everything changed. It was late, far later than Jack had intended to stay at the office, but the strange, inexplicable tension that had hung in the air all week had kept him from leaving. Something was happening tonight. He could feel it, a prickling sensation at the back of his neck that wouldn't go away. He tried to focus on his work, but the nagging sense of unease was too powerful to ignore. The office was dark and quiet, save for the faint hum of the terminal in front of him. Most of the staff had left hours ago, the lights dimmed to a low, ambient glow. Outside the large windows, the stars shone in the blackness of space, the distant glow of the spaceport flickering on the horizon. Suddenly, the quiet was shattered by the soft, almost imperceptible hiss of the door sliding open behind him. Jack tensed, turning his head slightly to see who had entered, but before he could fully react, he felt it, a sharp, jarring spike of awareness, like a sudden, blinding light bursting into his mind. Danger. The bond between him and Zalara flared to life in that instant, stronger than it had ever been before. He could feel her, a surge of emotion, raw and urgent, crashing into him through the psychic connection they shared. And behind that emotion, he felt something else: fear. Jack stood quickly, his heart pounding in his chest, as the sense of danger closed in around him like a tightening net. He spun toward the door, just in time to see a figure step into the room, their silhouette barely visible in the dim light. But Jack knew immediately that this wasn't one of his colleagues. The figure moved with a deliberate grace, their stance too confident, too practiced to belong to anyone on Hellian's payroll. A voice, low and unfamiliar, cut through the silence. "Mr. Marlowe, isn't it?" Jack's breath caught in his throat. "They know who I am." The figure stepped closer, and Jack could see them more clearly now. It was a man, tall and lean, his skin a sickly pale blue, his eyes cold and calculating. He wore the standard business attire of a Hellian employee, but there was something off about him, something predatory. "What do you want?" Jack asked, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. The man smiled, a thin, humorless smile that never reached his eyes. "I'm not here for you," he said calmly. "I'm here for her." The words hit Jack like a punch to the gut. Her. Zalara. Before Jack could react, the man took another step forward, his eyes narrowing. "You should have stayed out of it, Marlowe," he said. "But it's too late for that now." In that instant, Jack felt something snap. The bond between him and Zalara surged, a wave of psychic energy so powerful it nearly knocked him off his feet. His vision blurred, and for a moment it was as if he were seeing through someone else's eyes, Zalara's eyes. She was in her office, standing by the large windows that overlooked the spaceport. And she wasn't alone. Two figures, dressed in dark clothing, stood before her, their hands raised, weapons pointed at her. But Zalara's expression was calm, her silver eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. She didn't seem afraid. And then Jack felt it, a call for help. Silent but unmistakable. Zalara was reaching out to him, using the bond to draw him to her. Jack snapped back to reality, his heart racing. Without thinking, he bolted for the door, pushing past the man who had come for him. Zalara was in danger, and he was the only one who could help her. The halls of Hellion were eerily quiet as Jack sprinted through them, his mind racing. He didn't know what he would do when he got to her, didn't know how he could possibly help, but none of that mattered now. The only thing that mattered was getting to Zalara. He reached her office in what felt like an eternity, the bond between them pulsing with urgency, guiding him to her. The door to her office was ajar, and Jack could hear the low murmur of voices from inside. He hesitated for only a second before pushing the door open and stepping inside. The scene before him was exactly as he had seen in the vision. Zalara stood by the windows, her posture calm, controlled, despite the two men standing before her with their weapons raised. But now Jack could see the tension in her face, the way her fingers curled slightly at her sides as though preparing for something. The men turned toward Jack as he entered, their eyes narrowing in surprise. "Who the hell are you?" one of them snarled, his voice thick with menace. Jack didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on Zalera, on the way her gaze met his the moment he stepped into the room. And in that instant, the bond between them flared brighter than ever, filling the space with an almost tangible energy. "You shouldn't have come," Jack Zalera said softly, her voice laced with something he hadn't heard from her before: fear. But Jack wasn't afraid. Not anymore. He could feel the power coursing through the bond, the connection between them crackling with raw energy. He wasn't alone. The two men stepped forward, their weapons still trained on Zalera, but Jack could feel something shifting in the air. The bond between them was growing stronger, tightening around them both, feeding off their emotions, their shared will. And then, without warning, Zalera moved. It was as if time slowed. One moment she was standing still, her eyes locked onto Jack's, and the next she was a blur of motion, her hand snapped forward, and a pulse of energy rippled through the room, knocking one of the men off his feet. The other man barely had time to react before Jack felt it, the surge of power through the bond, driving him forward. Without thinking, Jack rushed at the second man, his body moving with a speed and precision that wasn't his own. He didn't know how, but he could feel Zalera guiding him, her thoughts, her movements flowing through the bond and into him. It was like they were one, their minds and bodies connected in a way that transcended the physical. The man raised his weapon, but Jack was faster. He slammed into him, knocking the weapon from his hand and sending them both crashing to the ground. The man struggled, but Jack was already on him, his fists moving with a force he didn't know he possessed. Within seconds, it was over. The man lay unconscious on the floor, his body limp. Jack stood, his chest heaving, his mind racing. He turned to Zalera, who stood over the other man's prone body, her silver eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of what had just happened settling over them like a heavy fog. "They're not the only ones," Zalera said finally, her voice steady but laced with tension. "The Kyrax have infiltrated the company. They're after me. After us." Jack's heart pounded in his chest. The Kyrax. He had heard the name before, an elusive, shadowy faction that operated in the darkest corners of the galaxy, their motives and methods shrouded in secrecy. But what did they want with Zalera? "What do we do?" Jack asked, his voice low, urgent. Zalera looked at him, and for the first time since he had met her, there was no trace of her usual calm. "We fight," she said quietly. "Together." And as the bond between them pulsed with newfound strength, Jack knew that whatever came next, they would face it as one. The Kyrax were coming for them, but now, Jack and Zalera were no longer just two individuals bound by circumstance. They were partners connected by something far more powerful than either of them had realized. And together they would be unstoppable. As the night stretched on, Jack and Zalera stood side by side, ready to face the enemies that lurked in the shadows, knowing that the battle ahead would be the most dangerous they had ever faced. But whatever came, they would face it together. The sleek hallways of Hylian Enterprises seemed colder, darker, now that Jack understood the full extent of the danger that lurked within them. The enemy had been hiding in plain sight, infiltrating the corporation with precision and patience, biding their time until they could strike. And now, that time had come. The Kyrax, a ruthless faction from a distant system, known for their brutal efficiency and advanced psychic manipulation, were not just here to sabotage Hylian. They were here for Zalera, for the power she possessed, a power that Jack had only just begun to understand. And because of the bond they shared, they were here for him too. Jack stood beside Zalera in her private suite, high above the sprawling expanse of the spaceport. The stars twinkled outside the window, indifferent to the turmoil within. The room was dimly lit, casting long shadows on the walls, as though even the light itself hesitated to touch what was about to unfold. The tension in the air was thick, crackling with the unspoken threat that loomed ever closer. Zalera's face was calm, but Jack could feel the undercurrent of emotion swirling beneath her composed exterior: the fear, the determination, the weight of the decisions she had yet to make. He could feel it all, as though her thoughts and emotions were his own. Their bond, once a strange, disorienting presence, was now a vital link, something that anchored them to each other in a world that had become increasingly dangerous. "They'll come for us soon," Zalera said quietly, her voice like velvet in the dim room. She stood by the window, her tall, regal figure silhouetted against the stars. "The Kyrax won't stop until they have what they want. And now that they know we're onto them, they'll strike hard and fast." Jack swallowed hard, the gravity of the situation pressing down on him. "What exactly do they want from you?" he asked, though he had a feeling he already knew the answer. Zalera turned to face him, her silver eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "It's not just me they want, Jack. It's the power I carry." She paused, as though weighing her next words carefully. "My species, the Neurans, are capable of great things. Our psychic abilities are beyond what most can comprehend. But with those abilities comes a danger. A rare few among us are born with something more, something powerful enough to reshape reality itself." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. "You're one of them." Zalera nodded, her expression grave. "Yes. And the Kyrax know it. They've been hunting me for years, ever since I escaped from my homeworld. They want to control me, to use my power for their own ends. And now that we've bonded, they'll want you too." The words hung in the air like a storm about to break. Jack had known that his connection to Zalera was more than physical, more than emotional, but now he understood the full scope of what it meant. The bond between them wasn't just a link, it was a fusion of their minds, their energy, their very beings. The power Zalera held was now something he could feel too, something that pulsed through him like a second heartbeat. "How do we stop them?" Jack asked, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at the edges of his mind. Zalera's gaze softened slightly as she looked at him, and for a moment he could feel her affection for him through the bond, a warm pulse of emotion that cut through the tension like a beacon in the dark. "We fight them together. The bond between us is stronger than anything the Kyrax could have anticipated. They don't understand it, and that gives us an advantage." Jack nodded, though the weight of the responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders. "What do we do first?" Zalera stepped forward, her fingers brushing lightly against his. The warmth of her touch sent a familiar pulse of energy through him, calming the storm of emotions raging in his chest. "First," she said softly, "we need to harness the bond fully. It's been growing, but you haven't tapped into its full potential yet. We need to become one mind, body, and soul if we're going to stand a chance against the Kyrax." Jack's heart pounded in his chest at her words, not just from the danger ahead, but from the sheer intimacy of what she was suggesting. Becoming one with Zalera, fully and completely, was more than he had ever imagined. But there was no fear in him now, only a fierce, burning determination. "How do we do it?" he asked, his voice quiet but resolute. Zalera's eyes glowed brighter, and she took a step closer to him, her presence filling the room with an electric charge. "Let me show you." What followed was unlike anything Jack had ever experienced. Zalera led him to a small, quiet room adjoining her suite. It was sparsely furnished, with only a single low platform in the center, surrounded by glowing orbs that floated in the air, casting a soft, ethereal light. The walls hummed faintly with energy, the very space itself charged with the same power that pulsed between them. Zalera motioned for Jack to sit on the platform, and he did, his heart racing. She knelt before him, her silver eyes locking onto his, and in that moment, it felt as though the entire universe had narrowed to just the two of them.
"Close your eyes," she whispered, her voice wrapping around him like a soft embrace.
Jack obeyed, his breath steady as he focused on the warmth of her presence, the subtle hum of the bond between them growing stronger. He could feel Zalera's fingers gently resting on his temples, and then, slowly, carefully, she began to guide him into her mind. At first it was disorienting. His consciousness seemed to blur at the edges, expanding outward, as if it were being stretched. But then, as Zalera's presence enveloped him, he felt at the bond a surge of energy that connected them in a way that transcended thought, emotion, and even physical sensation. Their minds merged, and in that instant, Jack could feel everything she felt: her fears, her hopes, her memories. He could see her past, the years she had spent running, the weight of the power she carried, the loneliness that had haunted her for so long. And then, deeper still, he felt something else, a well of power, vast and endless, hidden deep within her, waiting to be unleashed. It was a force beyond anything Jack had ever imagined, something ancient and raw, capable of bending reality itself. Zalara's voice echoed in his mind, soft and reassuring. "Don't be afraid. Let the bond guide you." Jack surrendered to it, letting the energy flow through him, his mind and body opening to the full force of their connection. He could feel the power building between them, a radiant heat that filled every corner of his being, binding them together in a way that was as natural as breathing. And then, in one brilliant, blinding moment, they became one. When Jack opened his eyes again, the world felt different, sharper, more alive. He could sense Zalara beside him, not just physically but mentally, as though her thoughts were intertwined with his own. The power that coursed through them both was electric, humming with an intensity that made the air around them vibrate. Zalara stood, her eyes glowing bright silver, and when Jack rose to stand beside her, he felt it too, the energy, the strength. It was as though a veil had been lifted, and now, for the first time, he understood the full extent of what they could do together. "They're here," Zalara said, her voice calm but filled with purpose. Jack nodded, his body thrumming with the power they now shared. "Let them come." The attack came swiftly. The Kyrax had been waiting for this moment, their forces moving with the precision of a well-oiled machine. The first wave hit Hylian Enterprises like a shockwave, a group of heavily armed mercenaries breaching the lower levels of the building, cutting through the security systems with terrifying ease. But they weren't here for the company, they were here for Zalara. Jack and Zalara moved as one, their connection guiding their every step as they made their way through the labyrinthine corridors of the building. They could sense the Kyrax closing in, their psychic energy crackling like dark tendrils that reached out, searching for them. "We need to hold them off until we can get to the core chamber," Zalara said, her voice steady despite the danger. "If they reach the core, they'll have access to the central power grid, and then they'll be unstoppable." Jack's mind raced, but the bond between them kept him grounded, focused. "What's the plan?" Zalara's eyes flashed. "We take the fight to them." And then they were moving again, faster now, their steps perfectly in sync as they raced toward the heart of the building. The Kyrax were closing in, but Jack could feel the power of the bond surging through him, a shield of energy that protected them both, guiding them forward. The first wave of Kyrax mercenaries appeared at the end of the corridor, their dark uniforms blending into the shadows as they raised their weapons. But before they could fire, Zalara lifted her hand, and with a single thought, the air around them crackled with energy. A pulse of psychic force shot through the corridor, slamming into the mercenaries and sending them crashing to the ground. Jack didn't hesitate. He could feel Zalara's power flowing through him, and with a surge of his own will, he extended the bond, amplifying the force of the attack. The walls shook as the energy rippled outward, knocking the remaining Kyrax off their feet. But this was only the beginning. As they pressed forward, more Kyrax appeared, and the battle intensified. Jack and Zalara fought side by side, their bond a constant source of strength, as they unleashed wave after wave of psychic force against their enemies. The building trembled around them, but they were unstoppable, their connection fueling their every move. It wasn't just power, they moved with purpose, their minds perfectly in sync, their bond stronger than ever. Every time a Kyrax soldier appeared, they met them with a force that shattered their defenses, leaving no room for error. But then, as they neared the core chamber, the real threat emerged. A figure stepped out of the shadows at the far end of the chamber, his presence radiating a cold, dark energy that made the air itself seem to freeze. Jack could feel the weight of his psychic power, a heavy, oppressive force that pressed down on them like a vice. "So this is the infamous Nirayan," the man said, his voice dripping with contempt, "and her human pet." Jack's blood boiled, but Zalara's hand on his arm steadied him. "Stay focused," she whispered, her voice calm but urgent. "He's the leader of the Kyrax." The man stepped forward, his dark eyes locking onto Zalara's. "You've caused us a great deal of trouble, Zalara. But that ends tonight. You will come with me, and we will take what's ours." Zalara's eyes narrowed, her silver gaze sharp and unyielding. "You'll never control me." The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We'll see about that." And then, without warning, he attacked. The psychic battle that followed was unlike anything Jack had ever experienced. The leader of the Kyrax was powerful, more powerful than any of the soldiers they had faced before. His mind was like a fortress, and his psychic attacks came fast and hard, crashing against the bond that Jack and Zalara shared. But they were ready. As the leader's dark energy surged toward them, Zalara raised her hands, summoning the full force of her power. A shield of light erupted around them, blocking the attack and sending it back toward their enemy. The man snarled, his eyes glowing with rage as he pressed forward, his attacks growing more ferocious. But Jack and Zalara moved as one, their bond unshakable. Jack could feel Zalara's power flowing through him, guiding him, amplifying his own abilities. Together they pushed back, their psychic energy combining into a single, unstoppable force. The room trembled as the battle raged on, the air crackling with energy. The leader of the Kyrax fought with everything he had, but Jack and Zalara were stronger. With a final surge of power, they unleashed the full force of their bond, a brilliant wave of energy that tore through the room and slammed into the Kyrax leader, knocking him to the ground. For a moment, there was silence. And then slowly the man struggled to his feet, his face twisted in pain and fury. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice laced with venom. "You can't stop us. We will take what's ours." Zalara stepped forward, her eyes cold and unyielding. "Not today." With a final, devastating pulse of psychic energy, she sent the Kyrax leader crashing to the floor, his body going limp as the light in his eyes flickered out. It was over. The aftermath of the battle was a blur. The Kyrax forces retreated, their leader defeated, their plan in ruins. Helion Enterprises had survived, but the cost had been high. The building was damaged, and the company's secrets had been exposed. But for Jack and Zalara, the real victory was the bond they had forged, a bond that had saved them both. As they stood together in the quiet of the ruined core chamber, Jack felt the weight of everything that had happened settle over him. The danger, the fight, the power they had unleashed, it had changed him. Changed them both. Zalara turned to him, her silver eyes soft and filled with emotion. "We did it," she said quietly, her voice filled with a quiet strength. Jack nodded, his heart full. "We did it together." And as they stood there, side by side, the bond between them pulsing with a warm, steady glow, Jack knew that whatever came next, whatever challenges they would face it as one. They were no longer just individuals bound by circumstance. They were partners connected by a bond that went beyond anything either of them had ever imagined. And together, they were unstoppable.